Hello, I'm Oliver Colling, and this is not the My 70s TV Childhood quiz. Oh no, this is the My 70s TV Childhood Doctor Who 60th Anniversary Quiz Special. Welcome back to our regular 1970s TV-related quiz. As many of you know, we are celebrating the 60th anniversary of what was a hugely important television programme for many of us who grew up during the 1970s. We've had such an enormous response to our special episode released last week, and it's clear how much Doctor Who was a staple of many of your Saturday tea times in the 1970s. As we mentioned in the last episode, we've enlisted our marvellous contributors to that episode to help us with some quiz posers for you all. This week, we're going to do something a bit different, and our first round will be made up of puzzlers set by our brilliant set of guests. As usual, it's just for fun, although I know some of you are wickedly competitive in this quiz. So settle down with your favourite beverage. It's a cup of tea again for me this week. Get your pencils and paper ready, and let's play. Round one, the experts' questions. So first up for question one, we've got Geoff and Paul from the Corner to Corner podcast. Welcome back. And do you have a question for our listeners?
Yes, Oliver, we do have a question for your listeners. One of the Doctor's most famous arch-nemesis? I don't know.
One of
the baddies.
One of the bad guys.
It is the Master. Quite often when the Master turns up, he uses a
cunning nom de plume.
Yes, a false name, which is never really that hidden, is it? You know, it's always quite obvious, but the Doctor never seems to kind of twig. But in one of the John Pertwee episodes from the early 70s, the Master turns up and he uses a fake name. The question is, what was the Master's fake name in the episode The Demons?
Thanks, Geoff and Paul. Question two comes from Stephen Schapansky from Radio Free Skaro.
Which of these four directors of 1970s Doctor Who also directed episodes of The Sweeney? Was it Lenny Mayne, Pennant Roberts, Douglas Camfield, or Michael E. Bryant?
That's a great question, Stephen. We love The Sweeney. On to number three, and number three comes from Mark Cockram from the marvellous Doctor Who All of Time and Space podcast. Mark, what question do you have to test our listeners?
Okay, I was trying to think of a question that wouldn't be too nerdy. So I've come up with this one. In the 1970s, when the Doctor was exiled on Earth, he became the scientific advisor to the military organisation UNIT. What does UNIT stand for?
Thanks, Mark. Next up, we have two questions from the brains behind the Kasterborous Classic TV podcast. Firstly, we have James McLean for question four. Okay, fire away, James.
Tom Baker's Doctor is seen reading a book in the television episode Destiny of the Daleks. The book is by Ulan Khulufid. To which famous British sci-fi series did this book belong to?
That's a great question, James. Hope you're enjoying these at home. And next for question five, we've got a question from James's co-host, Christian Corley. What have you got for us, Christian?
Which of these was not an earthbound vehicle of the Third Doctor? Bessie the Roadster, the Whomobile, or the Time Lash?
Ooh, now we all remember that John Pertwee's Doctor loved his vehicles and gadgets, but which one of those is the odd one out? I wonder. And our next three questions come from the hosts of the hugely popular Travelling the Vortex podcast. First, here's Keith Miles with question 6.
In the early 1970s, John Pertwee's Doctor fought aliens alongside the military organization UNIT. What was his role?
And a warm welcome back to Glenn Bartlett, who's got question 7 for us.
Elizabeth Sladen played Sarah Jane Smith, the Doctor's companion in both the third and fourth Doctor eras. In which 1973 story was Sarah Jane introduced?
And finally, Question 8 comes from Shaun Collins.
Throughout Classic Who, there has only ever been one story in which the Doctor traveled without a companion. Which Doctor and which story was it?
That's a great question, Shaun, and I'm not sure I know the answer to that one myself. I'm sure some of you listening do, though. Our last expert question, number 9, comes from Aidan Green from the 50% Doctor Who podcast. Welcome back, Aidan. What's your question for our listeners?
This might be a little hard because it's sort of behind-the-scenes trivia, so just give it your best shot. Tom Baker debuted in Doctor Who's Season 12. The season comprised of 5 stories: Robot, The Ark in Space, The Sontaran Experiment, Genesis of the Daleks, and Revenge of the Cybermen. Which of these stories did Baker have a fall in that resulted in him breaking his collarbone?
Thanks, Aidan. It's certainly a dangerous gig being Doctor Who. So that concludes round 1. And how are you doing? Our round 2 is about Doctor Who's adversaries from the 1970s. And question 1. Who were the aliens who attacked the Earth by posing as shop window mannequins? So which aliens posed as shop window mannequins? Question 2. The Silurians were cave-dwelling reptilians who were mistakenly left in suspended animation for millennia. Who were their slightly damp cousins? So who were the cousins of the Silurians? Question 3. Jon Pertwee's last adversaries as Doctor Who before he regenerated into Tom Baker were a group of, quite frankly, not very realistic looking what? So what were the not very realistic creatures? Question 4. Which Doctor Who serial pits the Doctor and his assistant Leela against the time traveller Magnus Greel, who's pretending to be a Chinese god in 19th century London? And I'm not making that up. That's actually the plotline of a much-loved episode of Doctor Who. Question 5. In the horror of Fang Rock, a rather spooky story set mainly in a lighthouse, which I remember being scared stiff by, which alien adversaries are planning to use Earth as a base for a war against their mortal enemies, the Sontarans? And finally, question 6. How many stories of Tom Baker's Doctor featured the Cybermen? I hope you managed to remember some of those. There were some really frightening adversaries that they all came up against, I do know. And so already we're on to our final round of today's special quiz. It's our general trivia round, TV Times, which today, as you'd expect, has a special emphasis on Doctor Who. Are you ready? Then let's play. Question 1. What was the name of the commander of unit? Question 2. Which of Doctor Who's assistants ended up marrying Tom Baker in real life? Question 3. In The Curse of Peladon and The Monster of Peladon, what was the name of the friendly ambassador who is basically a giant eyeball on top of a body? Question 4. In Day of the Daleks, what were the Neanderthal-like creatures who worked as the Daleks' henchmen? And question 5. The Master, played by Roger Delgado, remains a vivid memory for me and for many others. And as we mentioned in our podcast last week, he oozed menace even when he just looked at the screen. Unfortunately, he was killed in a tragic accident in 1973. But how old was he when he died? So there we are. Are you a Whovian genius, or do you feel like you need to be regenerated into another type of Doctor? And while you're checking your answers, let's give you the answer to last time's bonus question. So the question from last week: which of these presenters was not a regular host of the BBC's Sports Night midweek sport programme during the 1970s? A. Tony Gubber, B. Frank Boff, C. David Coleman, or D. Harry Carpenter? And well done to all of you that got it right. It was B. Frank Boff. Now, I know plenty of you did get this right answer because I did hear from you, but a special mention for Russell, who got in touch almost within minutes of the last quiz being released with the correct answer. So well done, Russell. And so on to this week's bonus question, and, of course, it's a Doctor Who related one. How many episodes of Doctor Who were aired for the first time in the 1970s? That means first transmission. Doesn't include repeat, and I'll allow a margin of 10 episodes either way. Good luck with this one, and I hope I've counted correctly. If you know the answer, why not share it with me by dropping your answer to me at quiz@my70stvchildhood.com. Okay, so let's go on to our answers. Firstly, let's hear back from our contributors with the answers to their questions. Question 1, Geoff and Paul from the Corner to Corner podcast.
So the fake name that the Master used in the Demons was Victor Magister.
Question 2, Stephen Schapansky's question from Radio Free Skaro.
The answer? Douglas Camfield. Directed several episodes of Doctor Who in the 1960s and 70s and also directed 6 episodes of The Sweeney.
And question 3 came from Mark Cockram from Doctor Who All of Time and Space.
And the answer is the United Nations Intelligence Task Force. So yes, they were a branch of the UN, although in the new series, apparently the United Nations took great exception to them using their name, so it had to be changed to the Unified Intelligence Task Force. So either of those answers, I suppose, would be correct.
And then we had our 2 questions from the Kasterborous Classic TV podcast. So, James, have you got some answers for us?
Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
And Christian?
The Time Lash is not a vehicle.
And our next 3 questions came from the host of the Travelling the Vortex podcast. And the first question was from Keith Miles, and the answer was John Pertwee's Doctor's role with UNIT was as scientific advisor. And the second question from Glenn Bartlett about Elizabeth Sladen, who played Sarah Jane Smith, in which 1973 story was Sarah Jane introduced? And the answer was The Time Warrior. And then finally from Shaun asked us, and this was a really interesting one that I didn't know the answer to. There has only been ever one story in which the Doctor travelled without a companion. Which Doctor and which story was it? And the answer was The Deadly Assassin, and it was Tom Baker. And finally, the last question that we had came from Aidan. Come on, Aidan. What's the answer? Where did Doctor Who break his collarbone?
The Sontaran experiment. Luckily, Baker notoriously dons a massive scarf as part of his costume, which served as a handy way to disguise his neck brace.
Okay, so how are you doing so far? Let's move on to round 2. Who were the aliens who attacked the Earth by posing as shop window mannequins? And that was the Autons. The Silurians are cave-dwelling reptilians who mistakenly left in suspended animation. Who were their slightly damp cousins? And that was a bit of a clue. They were the Sea Devils. And John Pertwee's final adversaries as Doctor Who were a group of not very realistic-looking giant spiders in Planet of the Spiders. Question 4. Which Doctor Who serial pits the Doctor and his assistant Leela against the time-travelling Magnus Greel, who's pretending to be a Chinese god in 19th century London? It was one which is very popular with many Whovians, I believe, The Talons of Weng Chiang. Question 5. The Horror of Fang Rock. Who was using the Earth as a base for war against the Sontarans? And it was the Rutan. And question 6. How many stories of Tom Baker's Doctor featured the Cybermen? And if you've been listening carefully to last week's episode, you know that the answer to that is only one, and that's The Revenge of the Cybermen. Okay, on to our TV Times round. Question 1. What was the name of the commander of UNIT? And that was Brigadier Lethbridge Stewart. Question 2. Which of Doctor Who's assistants ended up marrying Tom Baker in real life? And that was Lalla Ward, who played the second incarnation of his assistant Romana. And in The Curse of Peladon and the Monster of Peladon, what was the name of the friendly ambassador who was basically a giant eyeball? And that was Alpha Centauri. Question 4. In Day of the Daleks, what were the Neanderthal-like creatures who worked as the Daleks' henchmen? And that was the Ogrons, or the Ogrons. And Roger Delgado, who played the Master, tragically killed in 1973 at the age of 55. Well, I hope you did okay on our special Doctor Who-related questions. And particular thanks to our wonderful podcasters for their nuggets of Doctor Who knowledge. So thank you. Geoff and Paul from the Who Corner to Corner podcast. Stephen from the Radio Free Skaro podcast. Mark from the Doctor Who All of Time and Space podcast. Christian and James from Kasterborous, Keith, Shaun and Glenn from Travelling the Vortex, and last but not least, Aidan from the 50% Doctor Who podcast. They are all brilliant, so please do listen to them. If you want to share your scores with us, or any other thoughts about the quiz or the podcast, you can do so by visiting our blog at www.my70stvchildhood.com, comment on our social media accounts, or you can just email quiz@my70stvchildhood.com. Well, I hope you've enjoyed our fortnight of Doctor Who celebrations, and I do hope you'll join us for our next episode in a week's time, and our next quiz in a fortnight. Until then, thanks for listening, take care, and don't forget to subscribe, rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts, and to join us again soon for more from My 70s TV Childhood and the My 70s TV Childhood Quiz.